August 19th, 1942, 5:17 in the morning. The shingle of Dieppe beach is still dark, slick with sea spray, and the air smells of cordite and diesel. A Churchill tank named Bert grinds down the ramp of its landing craft and onto the stones, engine roaring, tracks churning. For 3 seconds, it looks magnificent. Then the tracks begin to slip. The loose, round pebbles of the beach, each one the size of a fist, are doing something no German gun has managed yet. They are eating the tank alive. Within minutes, Bert is going nowhere. Its tracks have shed themselves across the stones like a snake sloughing its skin. Around it, 11 other Churchills are suffering exactly the same fate, beached, immobile, and now horribly visible to German machine gunners in the cliffs above. 2 more have simply sunk on the way in. Of the 29 tanks that set out that morning to support the Canadian infantry storming Dieppe, fewer than half will even make it to dry land, and not a single one will return to England under its own power. By 11 o'clock, the raid is over. Within 10 hours, of the 6,086 men who landed, 3,623 have been killed, wounded, or captured. Every single tank that came ashore is lost. The newspapers, when they finally get hold of the story, will not be kind. Military planners, reviewing the wreckage in the weeks that follow, will describe the tank battalion's performance in language that strips away any pretense of glory. The Churchill, Britain's newest infantry tank, has just suffered the most public failure of its career, on a beach that should have made its reputation, not buried it. This matters, and it matters more than the simple arithmetic of a single disastrous morning might suggest. Because the tank, lying broken on the stones of Dieppe, is not actually a failure of engineering. It is a tank doing exactly what it was built to do, deployed onto exactly the wrong terrain, with no plan for what would happen when its tracks met shingle instead of mud. The lesson buried in that wreckage, half ignored at the time, would eventually transform the entire concept of an armored assault, and 2 years later, on a different beach, machines built on the very same chassis would do something almost nobody in 1942 thought possible. They would help win the war's most important single day. This is the story of how a tank nobody wanted became the tank nobody could land in France without. To understand why the Churchill existed at all, you have to go back further, to September 1939, and to a British War Office still thinking in the shadow of the previous war. The generals who drew up the specification for what would become the Churchill were haunted by the Western Front of 1914 to 1918, by mud, by shell craters, by barbed wire stretching for miles, by trenches that swallowed armies whole. They wanted a tank that could survive that kind of landscape if it ever returned. Not a fast tank. Not even, particularly, a heavily armed one. A tank that could climb out of a crater, push through wire entanglements, shrug off small arms fire, and keep crawling forward no matter what the ground threw at it. That original specification, known as the A-20, went to the Belfast shipbuilders Harland and Wolff, the firm that had built the Titanic, and by June 1940 they had 4 prototypes ready. But by then the war had already made their assumptions look hopelessly out of date. France had fallen in 6 weeks. The German army had not crawled through mud. It had raced across open country in fast armored columns, supported by aircraft, doing in days what the planners of 1939 thought would take years. The static, trench-bound war the A-20 had been designed to fight simply never happened. And now Britain faced something far more urgent. The very real prospect of a German invasion across the Channel, with almost no tanks left to defend the country, most of the Army's armor having been abandoned on the beaches around Dunkirk. There was no time for a leisurely redesign. The specification was hastily revised by Dr. Henry Merritt, the director of tank design at Woolwich, drawing on what little had been learned from the fighting in Poland and France, and in June 1940 the new requirements, designated A22, were handed to Vauxhall Motors. This was, on the face of it, an odd choice. Vauxhall built cars and lorries. It had never produced a tank in its history. But the company had already been developing an engine for the cancelled A-20 program, which meant it had spare capacity and at least some relevant expertise, and Britain, in the summer of 1940, could not afford to be choosy. The War Office gave Vauxhall an almost impossible deadline. The new tank had to enter production within 12 months. A team from the Department of Tank Design was sent to work alongside Vauxhall's own engineers. Because the firm had no institutional memory of how to build an armored fighting vehicle from scratch, and they were now expected to invent one against the clock while the threat of invasion hung over the entire country. Vauxhall delivered. A pilot model was completed by November 1940, barely 5 months after the specification landed on the company's desk, and the first 14 production tanks rolled out in June 1941, drawn from an order of 500 placed straight off the drawing board before a single one had been properly tested. It was named the Churchill, after the Prime Minister, and it looked the part. A long, slab-sided machine running on tracks that wrapped almost entirely around its hull, low to the ground, built less for speed than for endurance. But building 500 tanks from an untested design in under a year came at a cost. The early Churchills were notoriously unreliable, plagued by mechanical defects that triggered a substantial revision program through 1942 and 1943, with engineers working to fix problems that should, in any sane procurement process, have been caught before mass production ever began. What Vauxhall and the Department of Tank Design had actually produced, once the worst of the faults were ironed out, was a genuinely unusual machine. The Churchill weighed in at around 39 tons, stretched 7.5 meters from nose to tail, and stood just over 2 meters tall, low enough that its silhouette on a ridgeline was noticeably smaller than many of its contemporaries. Its armor, on the early marks, ran from 16 millimeters at its thinnest to 102 millimeters at its thickest across the front of the hull, figures that would later climb even higher, up to 152 millimeters on the heaviest variants, making it one of the most heavily protected tanks fielded by any nation in the war. For comparison, a typical family saloon car door of the period was perhaps 1 millimeter of pressed steel. The Churchill's frontal armor was, in places, more than 150 times thicker than that. Power came from a Bedford twin, 6-petrol engine producing around 350 horsepower, driving the tank to a top speed of roughly 27 kilometers an hour on a good road, which even by the standards of 1941 was sluggish. Speed had never been the point. What the Churchill could do that almost nothing else on the battlefield could match was climb. Its tracks ran the full length of the hull on a multitude of small road wheels, an arrangement that gave it extraordinary grip and stability on broken or vertical ground, the direct inheritance of that 1939 obsession with crossing shell-torn battlefields. It could haul itself up gradients that other tanks, British, American, or German, simply could not attempt without flipping backwards or losing traction entirely. Production was spread across a consortium of companies chaired by Vauxhall, including names more familiar from buses and railway carriages than from armored warfare: Birmingham Carriage and Wagon, Metropolitan Camel, Leyland, Charles Roberts, Newton Chambers, and Harland and Wolff among them, the very firm whose original A-20 had started the whole project. By the time production ended in 1945, roughly 5,640 Churchills of all marks had been built, though the precise breakdown between variants and the full scope of the more secretive specialist conversions developed later in the war remains difficult to pin down with total confidence given how compartmentalized wartime tank development records could be. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. After Dieppe, the Churchill's reputation was in tatters, and on paper the tank should perhaps have been quietly retired. Instead, in early 1943, it was sent to Tunisia with the British First Army, fighting through hill country against Rommel's forces and the German 5th Panzer Army, and there it found terrain that suited it far better than a Channel beach ever could. At the Battle of Longstop Hill in late April 1943, Churchill tanks of the North Irish Horse were tasked with supporting an infantry assault on Jebel Rahar, a position the German defenders considered impossible for tanks to reach because of its punishing gradients. The Churchills disagreed. They descended a gully, then turned and climbed the southern slopes directly, in places on inclines as steep as 1 in 3, a gradient many wheeled vehicles would struggle to walk up, let alone a 39-ton armored machine. One tank, led by a Sergeant O'Hare, was the first to crest the summit, arriving in the middle of a German strongpoint and capturing 50 prisoners on the spot. 3 more followed. The wider effect on German confidence in Tunisia appears to have been significant, even if exact figures on morale are, by their nature, impossible to quantify. Wehrmacht soldiers were reportedly in genuine disbelief that any tank could manage slopes they had assumed were naturally tank-proof, and Longstop Hill, the last major natural barrier on the road to Tunis, fell within days. The North African campaign ended shortly afterwards with the surrender of Axis forces in Tunisia. None of this undid Dieppe, but it began to rewrite, within the British Army at least, what the Churchill was actually for. It was the Germans who had set the bar the Churchill was originally measured against, and the comparison is instructive. The Panzer IV, the workhorse of German armored divisions for most of the war, was faster and, in its later versions, comparably armored, but it lacked anything approaching the Churchill's climbing ability, having been designed around very different doctrine. The Tiger, introduced in 1942, carried far heavier armament, an 88mm gun that could destroy a Churchill at ranges the British tank's own gun could not hope to match, and this disparity in firepower was real and persisted for most of the war. Britain's railway loading restrictions, which capped the width of any vehicle that needed to travel by rail, meant the Churchill's turret could never be widened enough to mount the largest available guns, leaving it consistently undergunned against German armor in 1944 and 1945. What the Churchill offered instead was endurance, protection, and an ability to go where Tigers and Panzer IVs simply could not follow. The American Sherman, the other major Allied tank of the war, traded the Churchill's slow, heavy armor for speed and mechanical reliability, and was generally faster to produce and to repair, but Australian Army trials conducted in 1944, specifically testing the Churchill against the Sherman, in jungle conditions found the British tank performed better overall in that terrain, a niche verdict, but a telling one. The vehicle that did the most to redeem the Churchill, though, was not the standard battle tank at all, but a stripped-down conversion built specifically for a single, brutal task. Following the Dieppe disaster, a Canadian engineer attached to the Department of Tank Design, Lieutenant J.J. Denevan, proposed a vehicle to protect demolition engineers as they worked under fire, precisely the gap that had doomed the raid in the first place. The idea matured under Major General Percy Hobart and his 79th Armored Division into the Churchill Assault Vehicle Royal Engineers, or AVRE, one of a whole family of specialist machines that would become known, with a certain amount of affection, as Hobart's Funnies. The AVRE replaced the Churchill's main gun entirely with a 290mm spigot mortar nicknamed the Petard, capable of hurling an 18-kilogram high-explosive charge known to its crews as the Flying Dustbin, roughly 140 meters, enough to crack open a concrete bunker that had shrugged off naval gunfire all morning. It had to be reloaded by hand, externally, through a hatch, a design compromise that meant the loader was briefly exposed every time the weapon fired, a sobering reminder of how much of this technology was improvised under pressure rather than perfected in peacetime. Other Churchill-based funnies could lay canvas matting across soft sand, carry bundles of logs called fascines to fill anti-tank ditches, or unfold steel bridging to span sea walls, each one solving a specific, previously unsolved problem from that morning at Dieppe. On June 6, 1944, these vehicles went ashore on the Normandy beaches, Sword among them, where Churchill AVREs supported the advance inland from the coast, their mortars used against the same kind of reinforced strongpoints that had stopped infantry cold 2 years earlier. at Saint-Aubin-sur-Mer on the boundary between Sword and Juno. The German position, known as WN-27, disabled the first Allied tanks to reach it before being silenced by 3 more, and the bunker there still bears visible scarring from AVRE fire today, alongside roughly 70 spent shell casings recovered from the position after the battle, testament to how hard its garrison fought before falling. The exact tally of bunkers and obstacles destroyed by AVREs across all 5 beaches on D-Day is not fully documented in surviving records, and some operational details remain genuinely unclear. But the surviving physical evidence across Normandy, scarred concrete, abandoned hulls, memorial tanks left exactly where they fell, speaks plainly enough. The transformation from Dieppe to D-Day was not a story of one machine getting better so much as one machine finally being used correctly. At Dieppe, the Churchill had been asked to do a job, supporting infantry directly off a landing craft and across loose shingle that nobody had properly tested it for. At Normandy, after Dennevin's proposal and 2 years of development under Hobart, specialist Churchills were sent ashore with a single, narrow purpose each: breaching, bridging, matting, mine clearing, and they were given engineering support and planning that the Dieppe raid had never provided. The tank had not really changed its fundamental character at all. What had changed was the Army's understanding of what that character was actually good for. The legacy of the Churchill is consequently a strange, divided one. As a gun tank, fighting other tanks in open country, it was outgunned by German armor for most of its service and never matched the firepower of a Tiger or even a late-model Panzer IV. As a hill climber and an assault vehicle, in the terrain it was originally designed to survive, it had few rivals on either side. Its influence outlived the war itself. The AVRE concept proved durable enough that the modern British Army still operates engineering vehicles built on the same principle. Descendants now based on the Challenger 2 hull, dedicated to the same job of clearing a path for everyone behind them, decades after the last wartime Churchill rolled off a production line. Soviet forces received over 300 Churchills under the Lend-Lease program and used them on the Eastern Front, a sign that the design's particular strengths traveled beyond British service even while the war was still being fought. The tank stayed in frontline British use until 1952, with at least one bridge-laying variant remaining operational well into the 1970s, a remarkably long career for a machine born out of a 1939 fear of trench warfare that never actually arrived. Surviving examples can still be found today at the Tank Museum in Bovington, where a working Mark III AVRE is preserved, and scattered across the Normandy countryside itself, where several Churchill AVREs remain as memorials close to where they fought, including one buried in the very shell hole it fell into on D-Day and later recovered and left in place as a permanent marker. Return for a moment to that beach in August 1942. A tank named Bert, tracks shed across the shingle, going nowhere, surrounded by 11 others suffering exactly the same fate. It would have been entirely reasonable, looking at that wreckage, to conclude that the Churchill was simply a bad tank, too slow, too unreliable, too poorly suited to the realities of modern war, and to scrap the whole program there and then. That is not what happened. What happened instead is that a Canadian engineer looked at the same wreckage and saw not a dead end, but an unanswered question. And 2 years later, on a different beach, in a different country, Churchills built to his specification helped tear open the most heavily defended coastline in occupied Europe. The tank that failed at Dieppe and the tank that succeeded at Normandy were, mechanically, almost the same machine. The difference was not in the steel. It was in the lesson learned from the men who watched it fail, and in the willingness, after one of the worst days of the entire war, to ask not whether the Churchill was good enough, but what, precisely, it had actually been good at all along. Bert never made it off that beach, but the idea that died with him on the shingle of Dieppe came ashore again on June 6, 1944, wearing a flying dustbin instead of a gun, and this time it did not stop.